Flowey is Not a Good Life Coach by Unrested Jake. Chapter 22. Can You Not? Papyrus woke to the rustle of the wind through the treetops. Short, strong gusts swept snow into eddying swirls in the air and piled it up into drifts. Half awake and dazed, Papyrus stared up at the treetops swaying back and forth. The hushed whisper of powdery snow and quaking pine needles nearly lulled him back to sleep. He wanted to sleep. Heaving a sigh, he rolled over, trying to get comfortable in the snow. Feeling resistance when he shifted his legs, Papyrus looked down to find he was waist-deep in a snowdrift that had built up next to the log he was leaning against. He sighed. Normally, he'd be irritated. Now, rusting armor and drenched clothes seemed like petty concerns. "Good morning, sleepyhead." Papyrus scrambled backward over the log, landing hard on his back. Flowey leaned over him, peeking through the fence of bones he'd surrounded himself with in his panic. "Gosh," Flowey said, grinning. "I've been right here this whole time, silly." "You were asleep for a long time for you." He tapped one of the bones, his vine sizzling at the contact. "I was starting to get kind of bored waiting for you to wake up." Papyrus didn't recall falling asleep, but he'd been so tired. He was still tired. Pushing himself into a sitting position with arms that were stiff and leaden, Papyrus scattered the bones. Spent magic drifted down around him, describing a glittering circle in the snow. With the bones gone, Flowey approached. He held something hidden in a coil of vines. "I brought you some breakfast," he said, with a touch of pride. "I hope you like ice cream. It's all I could get without making a mess." He shook out the coils, letting 3 nice cream packets drop into Papyrus's lap. Papyrus looked them over. They were grubby with dirt and somewhat crushed, but otherwise they'd weathered their trip surprisingly well. He only hoped the ice cream seller had been away from his cart. "How did you get these?" Papyrus ran his fingers over the wax paper. The hand-drawn logos were smiling up at him. Flowey pouted. "What is that supposed to mean? It's not like I have any money, Papyrus," he said, gesturing to himself. "Or pockets to keep it in if I did. I was just trying to do something nice for you." He winked. "That blue dope didn't even see me, so relax. He'll never miss it." Papyrus sighed, staring down at the stolen ice creams. He hadn't considered the practical aspects of his self-imposed exile. Something as mundane and trivial as food had been the furthest thing from his mind last night. Part of him still found it trivial. He set the ice creams aside. "I'm not hungry." Flowey glared, just for a second, then perked back up. "Don't be silly, friend. You haven't eaten for a whole day by now. You have to keep your strength up." Regardless, Papyrus had zero interest in food. All he wanted to do was go back to sleep. Just do nothing and let the snow drift up over him and nothing. When he'd left Snowdon, it had been without any sort of plan, only sure in the knowledge that everyone was better off with him gone. Now that it was morning, he still had nothing more in his mind than just being gone. No future tense, no later, no tomorrow. He had nothing. Nothing but a small pile of ice cream he didn't want. And Flowey. "Papyrus," Flowey said, picking up one of the packets and pressing it into Papyrus's slack hands. "Eat. There's no point in starving yourself." He prodded Papyrus's arm, urging. "I don't want it." Flowey frowned. "I went to the trouble to get you these." He drew closer, and his voice took on a warning edge. "I think you're being rude." "Sorry," Papyrus said, fidgeting with the packet but making no move to open it. Flowey stretched up to loom over him, hovering too close and staring. Papyrus was used to this move and didn't flinch, just kept his gaze trained downward. That didn't seem to be the reaction Flowey wanted. "You know, the heartbroken act is getting old fast. I'm being thoughtful, so the least you can do is be polite about it." Flowey grasped Papyrus's jaw, forcing him to look up. "Eat," he said, showing teeth, "or I'll shove it down your throat myself." Flowey wasn't mad. He wasn't capable of anger as anything more than a thought exercise. He most certainly wasn't disappointed. He had only spent the last 2 hours trying to find something for Papyrus to eat. The ice cream had been a stroke of genius, he'd thought. It was wrapped up, all clean and easy to carry, and it tasted good. Papyrus should count himself lucky that Flowey had put forth the effort to find something fresh, when he could have easily rooted through a trash bin for whatever wasn't entirely rotten and brought that instead. Flowey had expected a little gratitude, maybe even another hug. If nothing else, he'd expected Papyrus to eat. Papyrus glowered up at him defiantly. Was he trying to call Flowey's bluff? Cute. 2 could play that game. Flowey reached out a vine for one of the nice creams. Shaking his head free, Papyrus snatched the packet out of Flowey's reach, tore it open, and took a bite. His favorite chewed sullenly, glaring daggers at him. "That's better," Flowey said, satisfied. He backed off and watched the skeleton with a sense of minor accomplishment. Once Papyrus seemed to realize how hungry he actually was, he ate with less reluctance. It still wasn't the most pleasing reaction, but Flowey made the decision to let it go. He wasn't going to let anything ruin his mood today. Idly, Flowey considered how much it would have made his former self's teeth itch to see someone bite straight through something that cold. He remembered getting the worst sort of sudden headaches from eating ice cream too fast, and how it had made his teeth sting. Unpleasant sensations, but knowing he'd never feel them again lent them an odd charm. Papyrus ignored him for the time being, focused wholly on his food. He ate quickly but neatly. It was interesting to witness, given the lack of cheeks or lips or anything else Flowey would have thought necessary for the task. "Isn't this fun?" Flowey leaned against Papyrus, folding an empty packet into a paper star. Over time, Flowey had become as dexterous with his vines as he'd ever been with his fingers. Each fold was crisp and even. Every point on the star was perfect. He'd made so many of these as a child that he could fold them without thinking. Technically, he supposed he was still a child, if a plant could be considered a child, if Flowey could rightly be considered anything. Unnatural, yes. Damned, perhaps. And, possibly, slightly lonely. Last night had left him in a strange, thoughtful mood. Just because he didn't feel anything didn't mean Flowey was able to sit alone for long with no company or stimulation. He'd tried that, back when his curiosity had first turned toward what was, at the time, a troubling direction. He'd sworn to stay away from them, all his dear friends, until the thoughts retreated. To be alone, isolated, was torture. Talking to himself for the sake of hearing a voice. Plucking out petals and gnawing on vines to remind himself that he was real, even if it was in a form he despised. Expecting isolation to cure him had been foolish. The thoughts had stayed, had grown from whispers to howls and screams. The need to see something new, to interact, to alleviate the crushing boredom that was slowly and steadily unraveling him became an all-consuming fever. And so, to an intellectual sort of horror, Flowey had given in. The weight lifted. Those first times he'd been disgusted with himself. He'd apologized to each monster even as he toyed with them, even as he cut them down. From his current vantage point, Flowey couldn't for the life of him understand what the big deal was. Why had he waited so long? Why had he let himself suffer pointlessly for what felt like an eternity when relief was so close, so easy? After all, it didn't really matter what he did. No one stayed hurt or stayed dead, and no one remembered but Flowey himself. No harm done, and it kept him sane. Until he realized he was running out of things to do. Until the boredom returned, slow poison dripping into him. He was alone, playing with his toys. Playing games that were getting stale. Life wasn't fair. Exhibit A was still working on the nice cream. Poor Papyrus. How much had he suffered for Flowey's benefit? Flowey had befriended him countless times, killed him countless times, left him grieving and alone countless times. He'd told Papyrus riddles and played games with him, had tortured him to madness and heaped every kind of cruelty and humiliation onto him. And always, always, Papyrus offered forgiveness, acceptance, love. It was insane and maddening. No other monster clung so tightly to such a feeble ideal. Flowey couldn't figure out the mechanism behind it. No matter what he tried, he couldn't find the switch. That, above all else, was what made Papyrus his favorite toy. As simple as the skeleton was, he was unsolvable, unbreakable. He was endless entertainment. He was good company, willing to talk and to listen and to just be with him in a way that only Flowey's own parents were willing to match, but without all the baggage. Flowey would have loved Papyrus, if he were able to. Taking a mental step back, Flowey examined that last thought from every angle. Well, interesting. This is a little like a camping trip, don't you think? Flowey set the paper star on Papyrus's leg and started another. My sibling and I used to camp out in the courtyard, but I could never last the whole night without going back to our room. Isn't that pathetic? The safest place in the underground, he said, setting the second star next to the first. And I was still scared. The same sensation he'd had in the courtyard yesterday, was it nostalgia? Rose up behind his eyes. If only he hadn't been such a crybaby. Flowey rustled his leaves. He needed to stay in the moment. That was the trick. He'd wring as much enjoyment as possible out of what remained of this run, and that would give him the fortitude to try again and again, until he got his methods just right. He picked up the last empty packet, noticing the handwritten compliment inside. Have you been working out? Huh. We could build a fire tonight, he said, smoothing out the paper on the armor covering Papyrus's thigh. The teenagers do it all the time, so no one would think anything of the smoke. I know you like to be warm. The third packet he folded into a crisp little heart. He set it with the others. Finished with his breakfast, Papyrus drew his legs in, spilling the paper stars in the heart onto the snow. He tapped the stick from his last ice cream against his gauntlet. A metronome regular tick, tick, tick. His favorite wasn't nearly as much fun this morning as he'd been last night. Flowey huffed, winding vines around Papyrus's midsection and resting head in the protected space between pauldron and neck. Gee, Papyrus, you're all doom and gloom today, he said, nuzzling against the side of Papyrus's face. The bones were rough with old abrasions. You can talk to me, you know. I'm your friend. Papyrus turned his face away. He clamped the ice cream stick between his teeth, gnawing on it fretfully and staring off into the trees. Flowey drew back, studying the skeleton before speaking. Papyrus, how much do you know about love? There was a snap of the stick breaking, and Papyrus shot Flowey a skeptical glare, spitting out the splinters. Flowey giggled. Awake now? Papyrus was behaving so strangely, irritable and distant. It was a far cry from last night. Oh well, like that tooth he'd knocked out, yesterday's damage might well be irreversible. Considering Flowey's plans for today, that could be a hindrance or a help. It was too soon to tell. I'm not talking about gross, soppy love, he clarified, adding an exaggerated gag for good measure. I mean love. Slowly, Papyrus shook his head, as though he couldn't hear the difference. Gosh, Papyrus, you're so ignorant, Flowey said, knitting his brows in mock concern. You've gotten tougher since we've started having our little practices, yes? And your magic is more powerful. Papyrus glanced up at him, mistrustful. Yes, he said, quietly. Had the silly idiot really not thought about this before now? Probably not. All the sparring in the world couldn't have done that. You have to fight for real. You have to want to harm. Flowey giggled as the joke came to him. It's tough love. Curling up as small as the armor would allow, Papyrus folded his arms over his knees. He scowled pensively at nothing in particular. Or perhaps he was just nauseous. He'd eaten that ice cream pretty fast. You're not where you could be, though, all things considered, Flowey said, with an airy wave of a leaf. We can do better. Papyrus tensed. Not that it'll be easy, Flowey said, shrugging. People who are angry or self-righteous or hurt, they gain love like it's nothing. But a bleeding heart like you, Flowey sighed dramatically. All this time and effort, and you're still lagging behind. Papyrus was pathologically merciful. Even on the rare occasions that Flowey managed to push him beyond mercy into earnest hatred, he'd step back over the line mere seconds later. It was as though the gravitational pull of his own forgiving nature was inescapable, a kindness singularity. Flowey found himself desperately curious. If he only had time enough for a short-term goal, he wanted to know whether Papyrus could ever be cured. As soft as the skeleton still was, he had improved. That progress had been hard-won, and Flowey wouldn't see it go to waste if he could help it. He wanted to see Papyrus at his best. What could push him over that line for real? Flowey wanted to know. Papyrus was plainly more willing to harm than he normally was. What was the threshold they needed to cross? Were they close? What would happen if sweet, stupid Papyrus finally cut loose? Something awesome, Flowey wagered. Something new and ruinous. He wanted to see that. Gently, he tugged Papyrus to his feet, uncoiling his vines only once he was sure his favorite wouldn't sink back down into the snow again. Say, Papyrus, Flowey chirped, what do you say we go for a little walk? Despite the early hour, Grillby's was packed to capacity with snowed-in residents. Some were there to answer guard questions. Others were forming hastily organized search parties, although no one seemed to have much of a plan. Judging from the snatches of conversation that carried over the general din, a good many were just there to gossip and take in the spectacle. Used to watch my kids. I can't believe. You know what they say about. Always was something odd about those two, if you ask. In the farthest corner of a corner booth, Alphys rested her head in her hands, bleary-eyed and sniffling, her tail wrapped tightly around one ankle. She'd been up all night, helping Undine and the local guards turn the town inside out. Their search had turned up nothing. Less than nothing, in fact, as their frantic running around had disturbed any tracks or scent trail the local trackers might have been able to use. Papyrus had been gone for hours now. Every passing minute put him farther out of reach. Over the course of the night, Alphys had borrowed the phone of every monster she could ask, and each and every call had gone straight to voicemail. Her surveillance cameras showed no activity on the roads. She was at a loss. A pewter mug was set in front of her with a thump, beer sloshing over the rim. Alphys looked up into Undyne's haggard face as the guard captain slid into the booth beside her. They shared a quiet drink, mulling over what to do next. It had been a long night. Everyone was tired, and there was still Sans to deal with, but they had to find Papyrus. Neither of them knew why he'd run off now that his ordeal was finally over, but the way he'd acted last night, it couldn't lead anywhere good. The door swung open, banging against the wall. A hush fell over the bar. Silhouetted in the door frame, bits of straw stuck to his clothes and eye sockets shining overbright and manic, was Sans. He was shivering hard enough to audibly rattle. His gaze swept over the crowd and landed on Undyne and Alphys. "Where is he?" The woods were peaceful and still, pretty as a postcard. Flowey moved deliberately, watchfully. There was no movement in the underbrush, and no sound. The last hour had been much the same. It seemed they were well and truly alone. Naturally. Patience. As eager as Flowey was to administer his test, he found he was enjoying the build-up beforehand. What was going to happen? How would the test turn out? Would Papyrus pass or fail? By the end of the day, Flowey would have his answer, but for now he could only wonder and wait. If it weren't for the need to be as quiet as possible, Flowey would have whistled a tune. The snow here was pristine, left untouched for weeks or months until an icy crust formed over the top. Without the added weight of his armor, Papyrus likely could have walked along the surface. As it was, he broke through, sinking in knee-deep. His favorite toy was living up to the epithet. Papyrus trudged through the snow at a steady, brainless pace, like a clockwork soldier. He stared straight ahead, eye sockets dark and face neutral. Flowey couldn't tell whether he was lost in thought or not thinking at all. Either way, this new, placid attitude was fascinating. Papyrus was, in most runs, a completely open book. Flowey couldn't begin to guess what was going through that empty head of his right now, but it wouldn't be any of the endearing, inane drivel that occupied the skeleton's thoughts during more peaceful runs. It was wonderful. Aside from that token bit of resistance over the nice cream, Papyrus had been supremely biddable all day. No backtalk, no questions asked. The combination of quiet, mysterious calm and perfect obedience was compelling in the extreme, and Flowey's hopes were rising. This might be the run. Today might be the day that it finally happened. If Papyrus passed the test, not only would it serve as a proof of concept for this little experiment, but it would be amazing to witness. Flowey didn't care if he had to reset directly after he got to C. A little shiver of anticipation ran down his stem, for the first time in ages. This was going to be great. Papyrus walked with crunching footsteps through the deep snow. He had paid little attention to his surroundings, drifting in a strange, clear-headed apathy. Flowey moved beside him, not popping up at intervals as he usually did, but simply cutting through the frozen earth as easily as a fish through water. Flowey had directed him deeper into the woods, insistent on staying far from the roads. The muted crack of permafrost splitting apart and his own footsteps were the only sounds. They did not speak, not that Papyrus would have found anything to say. Now and then Flowey would tell him to turn this way or that, and Papyrus wordlessly did as he was told. It was easier than arguing. He didn't wonder what the test would entail. He didn't care. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. Pass or fail, it was all the same to him. Forcefully, he reminded himself that Alphys was still at risk. For her sake, he would try. In a thick stand of trees, Flowey made a soft chirp of elation and stopped, halting Papyrus as well with a vine pressed firmly to his breastplate. Papyrus lifted his gaze from the ground, watching Flowey for instructions. "Stay very quiet, Papyrus," Flowey whispered. "It's time for your test." He stared into the clearing ahead of them, a smile curling onto his face. "You're going to do great, so don't be nervous." Papyrus shrugged. He wasn't nervous, for once. He was too tired and too numbed out for that. Best just to get it over with. "Now, don't speak," Flowey said, placing the tip of a vine against Papyrus's mouth. With another, he gestured toward the clearing. "Do you see that snowdrake over there?" Papyrus followed the direction of the vine. A lone snowdrake was hopping around, making designs in the snow. After a moment, he'd recognized her as one of the teenagers who'd found his and Flowey's hilltop so long ago. He nodded. "I want you to kill her." The world tipped as a wave of dizziness threatened to send Papyrus to his knees. Only Flowey's quick reaction kept him upright, vines catching and supporting him. Flowey sniggered, shaking Papyrus lightly. "Did you just swoon? Gee, Papyrus, you're such a wet blanket." "What?" Papyrus's mind reeled, trying to wrap itself around the present moment in vain. "What did you say?" "You heard me the first time, silly." Flowey grinned, showing teeth. The snowdrake was still horsing around in the clearing, blissfully unaware. Papyrus could faintly hear her humming to herself. Flowey watched the girl as though observing a distasteful insect. "This is your test. Do this, and I'll forgive you for talking to Dr. Alphys and ruining everything." This had to be a joke. Flowey had to be playing a sick prank on him. I can't do that." Papyrus wrung his hands, bones grinding against each other inside his gauntlets. "I thought, didn't you want me to be a hero? I'm supposed to protect people, not... Flowey smiled and tutted at him. Now, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? This will make you so much stronger, you have no idea." He stroked his lower petals with a vine. "I wonder if you'll gain 1 level or 2. 2 wouldn't shock me." "I won't," Papyrus hissed, glaring up at Flowey. He was shaking, fear and anger and magic all twisting together. "I will never." "This is exactly why you're always the victim, Papyrus," Flowey spat, cutting Papyrus off. "You refuse to go far enough. All that ability. You insist on wasting it." Papyrus pointed at the snowdrake, arm cutting through the air like a blade. "She is a child." Unimpressed, Flowey rolled his eyes. "So was I. That's not enough." Flowey snapped a vine out to drag Papyrus closer by the wrist. "Don't spoil this for me, friend. We've come too far for you to wimp out now. It's not," he said, pulling, bringing their faces close, "a big deal. 1 hit. That's all I'm asking." Reflexively, Papyrus hauled back on his captured arm. Tears pricked at the corners of his eye sockets, and his chest grew tight. "I don't care what you do," he said, swallowing down panic and magic. "I won't do it. I'm not going to murder a child just because you tell me to. I don't care." Flowey smiled. "You're shaking pretty hard for someone who doesn't care." He slid the vine higher, wrapping Papyrus's arm up to the elbow. He squeezed and chuckled when Papyrus whimpered. "Let me put it to you this way. You're going to kill that snowdrake, or else I'm going to kill you. Right here. Right now. Papyrus took in Flowey's wide, cheerful grin. All traces of anger were gone, and somehow that was more terrifying than the threat itself. Do you doubt me? Do you know what I'm capable of, Papyrus? Flowey leaned in even closer, bumping their foreheads together and filling Papyrus's field of view with a yellow blur. Can you guess? The vine loosened, releasing him, and Papyrus staggered backward. Remember that I'm going easy on you, friend, Flowey said, parting jagged teeth. Make your choice. Don't keep me waiting too long. With that, he reached out and shoved Papyrus toward the edge of the trees. It was all Papyrus could do to stay upright, light-headed and weak-kneed as he was. He stumbled forward for a few yards before he had to stop. For a full minute, he stood with one hand braced against a tree trunk, waiting for the world to stop spinning. He wanted to go back to the morning, when he'd woken up sure that the worst had happened, that he'd lost everything, that he'd sunk as low as he could go. He'd been so wrong. It could always get worse. Life would only ever get worse. A sort of claustrophobic fit took hold of him without warning. Slowly he sank to his knees, fingertips scraping against the bark, spine bowing like a branch overladen with snow. He pressed his free hand against his mouth, stifling the despairing moan that he couldn't hold in. There was no way out. Flowey would never be satisfied. He would always find one more thing to take away, one more thing to ruin and defile. It would never end. He wanted it to end. Was this what it felt like? To finally be too tired to go on? He wanted it to stop, all this fear and misery and pain. If this was all his life would ever hold, then he should go back to Flowey and tell him to get on with it. He doubted that Flowey would spare the girl after killing him, but if there was even the slightest chance, then the way forward was clear. She was innocent in all of this. Papyrus willed himself to stand, to turn around, but his trembling limbs would not obey. He kneeled, gulping air that he didn't need and trying not to be sick. As close as the tree line was, the snowdrake would surely see him if she turned around. He had to decide. He should. No. As hopeless as the situation seemed, Papyrus didn't want to die. As tired as he wasn't quite that tired yet. There was only one option. Standing, Papyrus took a deep, shaky breath, steeling himself for what he had to do. Hands wreathed in the blue of his magic, he stepped out into the clearing. He didn't hurry, mindful of his armor rustling as he stalked through the deep snow. Kill or be killed. He had no choice at all. When he was only a few paces away, the snowdrake finally noticed his presence, whirling to face him. "Oh!" The girl smoothed down her feathers. "Mr. Papyrus, you scared the hell out of me!" She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his hands and face. Ice crystals formed around her as she tittered nervously. You okay?" "Listen to me," Papyrus whispered, low and harsh. "The forest isn't safe. You need to run to town as fast as you can. Now!" She blinked up at him as he backed her toward the trees. Just take it easy, dude." With a subtle motion of his hand, tall bones coalesced at Papyrus's back on either side, ready to sweep forward. A small blade of ice magic bounced uselessly off his chest plate. Papyrus shook his head. "Don't try to fight," he urged, watching the trembling snowdrake gather ice in front of her. "Just run." Why wasn't she moving? The girl stared beyond him with wide, terrified eyes. He didn't need to turn to know why. The sound of permafrost crackling rang in his head, clear as breaking bone and drawing closer. Out of time. "Don't stand there!" Papyrus shouted, summoning his blaster. "Go!" Spinning on his heel, Papyrus swept the bones out in front of him just as the first hail of bullets hit. Bones and bullets alike shattered. He was dimly aware of the snowdrake's screech of alarm and her quickly receding footsteps as she fled into the woods. Training his blaster on Flowey, he fired. The blast pulled at his soul, bleeding his magic away. A barrier of bones raised up before the blaster fully dissipated. Papyrus would keep Flowey at bay for as long as he could. He would attack with everything he had. He wouldn't win, but he could buy her time to get away. That would have to be enough.